The internet has revolutionized the human experience in the 21st century. Our ability to communicate with others, find locations in unfamiliar places, and access information from across the globe has never been easier, and new media like blogs and podcasts have connected voices to audiences in ways that were not previously possible. In spite of all these incredible benefits, many of us are beginning to sense that all this connectivity is changing the way we think and interact with one another. So, how is the internet affecting our brains, and should we be concerned about it? How is the internet different from other media technologies such as print, radio, and television? And is Google making us stupid? In this episode of The Road to Now, we get the answer from New York Times bestselling author Nicholas Carr.
I'm Bob Crawford.
I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
Ben, we've got an action-packed introduction here today.
Oh, do we?
Yeah. So you did an interview with Nicholas Carr. Could you tell us a little bit about him first?
Yes, Nicholas Carr is outstanding. He has written a lot about how the internet affects our brains and what technology is doing to us. He wrote a very well-known article called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" in The Atlantic a few years back. He's got a newer book called The Shallows, and he's done a great job of putting technology in its historical context. A lot of times we hear people saying that, well, this is just a new technology. Either it's all good or, yeah, there's some bad, but we've adjusted over time. That's just the way humans are. But he's really pointed out that this moment with the way the internet and computers are infiltrating our lives, that it is very different than past technologies. We brought him on as a part of a talk he's doing at MTSU. And if you're listening and you would like to come, it's March 27th, Monday night. We'll have information about that on our website for this podcast. And so that will be a week from the day this is airing. Our chair, Susan Myers-Shirk in the history department at MTSU, was kind enough to work this interview into his visit. So I'd like to thank them, the history department, and particularly Susan, for making this happen. And I think you guys are going to find yourselves listening to this and really, really thinking about whether or not that smartphone that you may be listening to this podcast on, whether or not that's a good thing. Just know right now it is. Right now, it's great.
I think of this as being a companion to our Bradley Fiedler episode on the history of the internet.
Yeah.
With Nicholas Carr's work, I think about when Bradley told us at the end of the episode that if you want to get away from technology, you got to go to the beach and walk into the ocean and keep walking and keep walking. And if you get far enough, the sonar radar will hit you. So you really can't get away from the technology no matter where you go in our world today.
Yes, it's true. I mean, we're human beings. We evolve. We've adapted to many things. I think this likely will be a deep transformation, but as with anything, technology is just a tool. What we do with it is up to us. So be mindful of that and listen to what Nicholas has to say, and then it may be a good calling card to give yourself some space.
And Ben, that's a great segue, because you and I have used technology to start this podcast.
Absolutely.
And it's a lot of work to do a podcast.
Yes,
and
it
at
is.
times it costs money.
Oh, it costs money a lot.
And so we have been recently beginning to look into getting sponsorships for our podcast. And it's really hard because you don't want to just partner with anyone.
Right.
You want to partner with someone who you feel fits the culture of your program.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've laid back, and we have not actively pursued folks, but then, as it may be, the godfather of so much has come and is supporting us.
That's right. We're happy to introduce to everyone today Dolph Ramsor from Ramsor Records. Dolph, welcome to the show.
Well, honored to be here. Thanks for letting me be supportive of the show, and I'm honored to kind of chip in a little bit.
Dolph, we're excited to have you on board. What do you hope our listeners will learn about Ramsor Records?
Well, music is it's hard to deny the impact that it's had on us. And from a historical point of view, music is, I think we learn a lot about ourselves through music. And I've always been fascinated by the history of recorded music, but I'm also fascinated by history. Oddly, it was my best subject in school. I was not the best student, but I always did very well in history. I'm proud of that fact. And I think having four grandparents that were born in between 1900 and 1908, I mean,
Wow.
that's 117 years ago now. So I remember asking my grandfather about the Titanic going down,
Oh, man.
or World War One. He was too young to fight in World War One. He was too old to fight in World War Two. But yeah, I guess Ramsar Records is, I mean, we're a lot of things. I've put out some historical kind of recordings, and I don't know. I think all the recordings I put out one day, I hope will be historical.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with you because you work with the Avett brothers. But tell us about some of your other acts. I'm thinking about Sammy Walker, someone who I think who has a historical presence in today's music. Tell us a little bit about him. You've done some great work with him.
Yeah, Sammy's from Norcross, Georgia, and was discovered by Phil Oakes. And Phil Oakes was a famous folk singer, protest folk singer. Sammy's first album was called Song for Patty, and it was about the Patty Hearst kind of episode. But yeah, Sammy, he sounded a lot like Bob Dylan, and I think that probably hurt his career. But he made some great records, two for Warner Brothers, two for the Folkways label. He was a massive Woody Guthrie fan. He had one album that was just strictly Woody Guthrie covers. I feel like he needed to be heard, and he was sort of forgotten. So I've reissued some of his recordings.
What are some of the other acts that you have that are out there working right now that are putting out great records? Is there another band or group that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
Well, there's Bombadil has a current record out now called Fences. And one great thing about a couple of my releases, they with Bombadil's new record and Samantha Crane's new record, they were recorded onto tape. Most albums today are recorded. We're talking about technology. Recorded onto hard drives, and these were actually recorded how records were made from like 1950 to probably 1990. Things were recorded onto tape. These albums were recorded onto tape, both Bombadil and Samantha, and the vinyl was cut from the tapes. So I kid that no computers were harmed in the making of the records. David Childers, another act that Bob has worked with. We have a new record that's coming out May 7th, I think. If I'm wrong on that date, don't kill me. But yeah, I'm really proud of that one too. So yeah, we've got some things out and about, and we're always looking for up and coming things as well.
Speaking of David Childers and Bob Crawford and Ramsar Records, wasn't there a collaboration those all did together at one point called the Over Mountain Men?
You're right, Ben. You're right. And we hope to have David on the show here in the next couple of weeks leading up to his record release. And he is a great learned man of history himself. He's actually a true Renaissance man. I mean, a real deal Renaissance man. He worked in the legal profession for many years. He's a painter. He's, of course, a songwriter. He's a great, I don't want to say fan of history because it goes deeper. His interaction with history and some of the things that he involves himself with in his study of history go a little bit deeper than just being a fan of it. So anyway, everyone can look forward to that. Everyone can look forward to that coming up soon. And over the weeks and months, we'll be talking more and more about the great artists on Ramsar Records. And we're just really, Dolph, we're just so happy to partner with you on this. We're just really excited about it. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you.
And let me just say that, I'm honored too, because I remember meeting Dolph. I think it might have been in 2003 or 2004 for the first time, when Dolph had showed up and put his backing behind a little startup called the Avett Brothers. And here we are today, and I'm honored to be part of something that Dolph is doing, because I've seen over the years, Dolph has really. I remember one time he was referred to in the local press in Charlotte as Charlotte's Colonel Tom Parker. And I was like, "That's it." And Dolph's been so great, and I love seeing him. I've gotten to speak to Dolph at Avett shows and other events over the years, and, I've always admired that he has this incredible eye for talent and this reverence for history and reverence for music, and, that he's on this team now, like, it's one of those things where I'm kinda going, "Wow, I do maybe I have talent?" Or maybe Bob has enough talent for 2 people, I'm not sure, but I'm honored to have Dolph and Ramsey Records here with us.
Well, our Cabarrus County influences continue to grow and deepen, so I'm sure you guys are all happy about that.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
All right, Dolph. Well, thank you for stopping by and enjoyed the Nicholas Carr interview.
Nicholas Carr, welcome to The Road to Now.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, and, we're doing this interview as a part of an event we're gonna be doing at Middle Tennessee State University where we invite Nicholas Carr here to speak, and he's going to give, a talk about technology. And one of the things I love about your work is we live in a world where it seems like the powers that be have nothing but positive things to say about technology and the internet and all of its applications. And the general characterization of people who are not comfortable with technology is that they're backwards, they're reactionary, they're luddites, they're just not happy and they don't want to get with the program. And yet you have a criticism and a critique of what technology is doing to us that is not reactive, but is incredibly proactive and incredibly intelligent. So if you could start off by just explaining to us what is it about what is it about the internet and the technology that's come from it that you see as worthy of critique?
Yeah, and you know, I should start by saying, I grew up with computers and have always found them fascinating and really enjoyed them. And so I don't come to my criticism of the technology out of any kind of fear or reaction against computers, but what's happened over time is I think the personal computer has been transformed in a way from a tool that an individual could use to get to accomplish certain things, creative things, productive things, to becoming more of a medium that wraps us in a particular kind of environment. So now we're kind of always connected, always online, constantly interacting with our computer or our phone or social media and so forth. And what I realized, and this started by kind of exploring my own habits and my own thoughts when I've used computers, is I became concerned that the technology was encouraging superficial thinking, a kind of growing dependency on apps and software to get even to get pretty much anything done in our lives, and
Right.
was essentially creating this culture of what I call distraction and dependency. That seemed exactly the opposite of what I what I enjoyed about computers
Right.
to begin with, and so I began, becoming more skeptical and critical of the technology.
And you've written a lot about the research about, one, what this does to our brains, and two, the problems that come, from essentially creating a platform that we rely upon is run by a very small group of people. And I just picked up your most recent book of essays, Utopia is Creepy, which is great. And you start off your first
Thanks.
essay uh, is about Web 2.0. It's called The Amorality of Web 2.0. Could you explain to us what is Web 2.0? How is it different than what came before, and what makes it amoral?
Sure. So you have to go back a little more than 10 years ago. There was the great internet bubble of the late 1990s and into 2000, 2001 that collapsed. And for a while in the early years of our new century, people were very down on the internet. They had thought it kind of had peaked and so forth. And then around 2004, 2005, the nature of the internet and I think the nature of personal computing changed with the arrival of social media. And back then, this was called Web 2.0 to distinguish it, of course, from the first decade of the web that hadn't ended well. And so Web 2.0 was what we now refer to as the social web, social networking, Facebook, Twitter, all of those things. And back then, around 2005, which is when I started my own blog, there was all this utopian thinking about social media, and it would democratize media. It would pull power away from big centralized corporations and give everyone a voice, and it would lead to greater harmony and deeper discussions. And what we've seen since then, I think, is that it's much, much more complicated than that.
Yes.
And in fact, in many ways, the so-called Web 2.0 or social media has had the opposite effect. It's kind of led to greater polarization, political polarization, social polarization. It's true that it's damaged a lot of big media companies, particularly print media companies, but in their place we have these even larger centralized corporations like Google, like Facebook, like Amazon, like Apple, that increasingly control the flow of information, entertainment, political information, news, as well as just our day-to-day conversations. And so what I argued in that particular essay is that we shouldn't assume that technology is beneficial or that it's moral or that it's naturally ethical. Right. We should assume it's amoral, that really what it comes down to is how these systems are designed, how they're used, and that determines whether they end up being good or bad. And it's not just the technology itself that is necessarily a force for good in society.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that with these things we have to make claims like that, right? I mean, we essentially understand that every technology in itself is neutral. It's all how we use it. And yet this is the kind of stuff that, as I myself am a history professor, and I lecture, and I incorporate, learning tools into my classes through the readings. But I lecture in class and I use PowerPoint and things like that. But I don't allow any of my students to use any cell phones in the class. I don't allow them to use computers, and except for in very rare cases. And this is for me based on research that I've done that has demonstrated, for example, that when you type notes, you don't process them. Handwriting matters,
right.
and learning to concentrate and build community instead of living online are better things. Yet I think sometimes when I tell people that, even within my own academic community, they're like, "Oh, come on, get with the program, man. Why are you holding back?"
Yeah.
As if the technology is inherently this positive thing.
Right. I mean, unfortunately, and again, I say this completely acknowledging that good technology can have very good effects, but there is this belief, or there's this confusion that we as a society, I think, have arrived at, where we equate technological progress with social and cultural progress. So, as long as we get a new iPhone, model every year or two, then everything's going along fine. And it seems to me, you can understand this because, new gadgets are cool and we kind of gravitate toward them and stuff. And so we imbue them with this sense of that they must be beneficial, that as long as they're getting better, everything must be getting better. And it kind of turns off our natural critical mind and skepticism. And I really think at this point, given the enormous role these technologies are playing in our lives and in society, we need to be much more critical and much more skeptical about how they're designed, what the motivations of the companies behind them are, and how we're using them personally.
Yeah, let me tell you how many times I've heard someone say, when we talk about the gap between the rich and poor in the United States growing, how many times I've heard people say, well, even the poorest people can get a smartphone now, right? So that must be good.
Right.
It's kind of an interesting mark of civilizational development,
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect symptom of the misperception that I'm talking about, or the confusion.
Yeah, so you say as Web 2.0 has developed and or what we call Web 2.0 has developed, that this has given more and more power to particular companies, and I think that there's no question about that. And one of your most well-known essays from the Atlantic, I believe it's in 2008, was called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And
Yeah.
and could you explain, what is Google's role in all of this?
Well, the title, I focus on Google, but the article is really about the internet in general.
Right.
But I think Google is kind of the perfect representative of a trust. I think what underlies Google, what has underlain Google from the beginning, is a belief that if we can get more access to information delivered to us more quickly, then we'll all get smarter. Because we'll be able to search for anything, and all of this information will be unlocked, stuff that used to be hard to come by. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think all of us would agree that opening up access to information is in general a good thing. But what was missing from Google's view, and this became kind of the popular view as well, was an understanding that it isn't just access to information that determines the depth of our thinking. It's how we process that information, how we take it in, how thoughtful we are, how attentive we are. And what turned out is that I believe that the way that companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and so forth have designed their services, they've designed them in such a way that we're kind of constantly distracted, constantly interrupted, constantly dealing with notifications, many of which are completely trivial, some of which are very important. And what happens is we're so compulsively engaged in information gathering that we never step back from the flow of information and actually think deeply and attentively and calmly about the information we found. And it turns out that, information is a very different thing from knowledge.
Right.
And knowledge requires you to back away from interruptions and distractions and actually, have a calm, attentive mind and go through these things, because it's only then that you create rich associations and connections between the different pieces of information you've collected, and that's what gives contextual richness to your thinking and ultimately leads to knowledge. So we have this great, the internet provides us great access to information, but it provides that information in a way that defeats our ability to process the information well and to turn it from information into knowledge.
Right, and you've written about how this actually has a real tangible effect on our brains. Could you explain what that tangible effect is?
Yeah, and so it wasn't that long ago that people used to think that, once you hit the age of 20, your brain was pretty much fixed and it didn't change from then on. And what we've learned is, through experiments in what's called neuroplasticity, is that throughout our lives, our brains are adapting to the environment that surrounds us. And in particular, what happens is when you develop new habits of thought, they get entrenched in your brain. I mean, in the actual connections between your neurons. And what I argue is that if you think about what the big change in our environment, the environment in which we're doing our thinking, has been over the last 20 years, it's that we've begun using computers, and now particularly smartphones, to kind of help, I use that word in quotes, with our perception of the world, our gathering of information, our processing of information, our ways of communication. And so I think when you begin to look at the habits of thought that are encouraged by the technology, and as I say, I think it's thought that's distracted and divided attention and so forth. I believe that it's always been hard for human beings to pay attention.
Right.
Our instinct is to be distracted and glance at the next bright, shiny thing that comes through our field of vision. So this has always been a challenge, to kind of turn off the spigot of information and actually have a coherent train of thought that extends for a long period of time. And I think the net and social media and smartphones have actually made what was already a difficult challenge much, much harder because they do encourage this constant stimulation that tends to encourage us to think superficially rather than to really engage the deep thinking that our minds make possible.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that fascinates me, how quickly we can adapt as human beings. Because I mean that's I always point out to my students in my classes, like, think about this. We're a species that lives at the equator and can survive at the poles. We adapt, we can adapt. That's one of our amazing things. And I remember, I think when I was in graduate school, before I had my own computer or internet at my house, like in 2005 or 2006, I think I'm revealing exactly how little money I had when I was younger. But I remember, like, the whole thing would be, you would go to a computer. I remember when I was an undergrad, I had to drive to campus to use a computer. And those early days with this kind of like internet at your fingers, you would notice when you went down like the Wikipedia hole or down the Google hole, you'd just be like, oh my goodness, I just spent like an hour at the library and just read one thing after another, and I jumped from everything. And you would notice that. And now I wonder how many times a week that I do that, and it's just become part of my daily life. And that's, a course of 10 years, the technology, and I don't even notice that anymore.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is I think you're absolutely right that we are extraordinarily adaptive animals, physically and mentally. And in general, that's a great thing. I mean, Thank goodness we can adapt quickly to changes in our environment. But we have to realize that adaptation is a value neutral process. The process of adaptation doesn't necessarily make us better. It may make us more superficial thinkers if that's what the kind of technology or the environment encourages us to do. And I think that's what's been going on. And I think you're absolutely right that, there was a time, and it wasn't very long ago, that to some degree, your online life was segregated from the rest of your life, and you actually had to make a decision to go online and to use these kind of tools. And at least that imposed a certain discipline and encouraged a little critical thinking. Now there's no distinction between, our online lives and our offline lives because, with a constantly connected smartphone that we're tend to look at, and this is what studies show about 100 or 200 times a day, there's just no boundaries anymore.
Yeah, and some of us, if you are roughly my age, which is 38, some of our listeners will remember when your connectivity to the internet relied upon you waiting till your parents went to bed and then plugging your phone line into a modem and dialing it up and connecting to the internet.
Yeah, well, I can remember. I'm a bit older, but I can remember, getting an America Online account where you had 5 hours of time a month. That was it. And it didn't seem so bad, actually. I kind of wish it was like that again.
Yeah, I mean, and that gets back to the point you were making earlier, and kind of, that has infused this conversation, which is there is something to be said for scarcity. Scarcity allows you to budget better. When something is ubiquitous and in many ways, very little cost to accessing it, oftentimes, we don't appreciate what we have, and that's not always a good thing to have a lot of something.
That's right. In a more recent book I wrote called The Glass Cage, I kind of take that argument to the whole area of automation and our dependency on computers and robots and apps to do more and more things in our lives. And we tend to gravitate to that because it gives us this feeling that it's freeing us up and it's making our lives more convenient and it's removing challenges and difficulties from our lives. But it turns out that it's only by coming up against hard challenges and kind of dealing with scarcity and figuring hard things out, and that we both develop rich skills and that we get the satisfaction of overcoming challenges and developing those skills. And so often, and this is a kind of tragic consequence, I think, of our dependence on computers, we're very quick to think that, this app will make my life a little more convenient, and so we start to use it, and we don't realize until it's too late that actually it's removed from our lives some of the challenges that gave us an opportunity to develop new talents and to feel the satisfaction that comes from that.
Yeah, the fleeting, the instant gratification, it's already something that I feel like a lot of us have a tendency to want anyway.
Right.
And sometimes with the way the internet allows us to, as my friend Josh Wagner, we talk a lot about these things, and we talk about culture. He's a comic, and we talk about the other day, and he's only 25. He's already getting this stodgy notion, but he's like, like 10 years ago, if you wanted to be into something, you had to be into something. You had to go to the library and get a book. You had to read up on it. You had to know it. Now you can be an expert on anything in 15 minutes.
Right. And then you forget it all 15 minutes later.
It's so true. It's like a wave comes up there, it's big, and washes right away. I wanted to put this in historical context because every generation's pretty convinced that the sky is falling. Now it's smartphones, but before it was Elvis Presley. Before that, it was hoop and stick. These things are going to ruin our culture. But you make some really compelling points about how this is different from what came before. And in your work, you point out some pretty interesting precedents of people saying a new technology was going to change things, going back as far as Socrates, 400 BC. Could you talk about some of the cases that you bring up in your work, and then how the internet itself and Web 2.0 is different?
Yeah. So, beginning with Socrates, who was really worried that the arrival of reading and writing was going to ruin people's memory. And there was a lot of truth to that. As it turned out, it did, erode people's memory, but it ended up giving us a lot of benefits that he didn't foresee. But it's definitely been a theme in culture that any kind of new technology, particularly a communications technology, a media technology, is resisted, and people fear that it's going to take away something important from their lives or from society. And often it does, but usually what we get in return has been better. And certainly we saw this, for instance, very clearly with the arrival in people's homes of television in the early 1960s. And a lot of people, saw how people behaved in watching TV, thought we'd become these passive consumers of information and entertainment. And again, there was some truth to that. But I think our current technology, internet technology, computer technology, smartphone technology, digital technology in general, is fundamentally different from anything that's come before, even from television. Because, unlike television, people might have watched it a lot, but they didn't watch it continuously.
Right.
You didn't have a TV in front of you when you were in a classroom. You didn't have a TV in front of you when you were at your job. You didn't carry a TV around in your pocket all day. So there were times when you watched TV, when you interacted with this technology for better or for worse. And then there was a lot of time in the day when you weren't. With the smartphone in particular, we're kind of always interacting with the technology. And you can see this in behavioral studies. I mean, particularly for a lot of young people, but I think for people of all ages, often the very first thing they do when they wake up before they get out of bed is look at their smartphone. And the last thing they do before they go to sleep is look at their smartphone. And then, as I said, between 100 or 200 times during the course of the day, they're interacting with their smartphone, every couple of minutes of their waking lives. So we've never had a technology that is so deeply influencing the way we perceive things, the way we think about things, the way we communicate with others as this new digital technology does. So I really think, that the argument that, people have always worried about technology, so we don't have to worry about this one, I just don't think that that's the proper approach to take when you do have a new technology that is so intimately involved with all aspects of our lives. I think we really owe it to ourselves to look at this technology very critically to see if, it's designed in ways that encourage us to get the most out of our lives, and whether we use it in those ways, or whether it's just a technology that increasingly encourages us to become more and more dependent and more adapted to it. And so I think this really, we are seeing something new in the world, and we should appreciate it as something new in the world.
Yeah, and when you say dependent, that's not just I've read research that suggests that, when we look and we get these updates on our phones, we become so into it that our brains begin to release dopamine, and it almost literally does become an addiction.
That's right. I mean, it certainly becomes a compulsion, and and the reason that our brain releases dopamine when we find new information, or even when we're searching for new information. At least this is what scientists believe, and I think it makes sense, is that, if you go back many millennia ago when we were living in the wild, you wanted to know everything that was going on
Right.
around you in the environment because that's how you stayed alive. So we have this deep instinct where we're getting rewarded by dopamine, a pleasure-producing brain chemical, whenever we get a new piece of information, and we take this really deep instinct into our new digital environment where there's no end to new things to look at and new bits of information to process. And I don't think, it's a surprise that given that we start to exhibit this compulsive kind of behavior that does start to look like addiction.
So in some ways, the companies that we look to as benevolent suppliers of these things that help us are in some way exploiting our very nature.
I think they're very much doing it. And it doesn't mean that they have necessarily evil intentions. But look, I mean, if you look at the big internet companies, a company like Facebook makes more money the more time you spend online, the more quickly you jump from one piece of information to the next, because the more you do that, the more information it collects about you and the more opportunities it has to show you ads. And that's how it makes money, and that's what it's going to pursue. And, Facebook has a whole team of behavioral psychologists that are optimizing the service to keep you hooked.
Yeah, and that explains a lot of it with social media as well, right? Because sites like Facebook, they build in programs that keep you seeing things that make you happy so that you don't storm off, right?
That's right. And, they're very, very sophisticated. One thing we should be concerned about is, it's the algorithms of companies like Facebook that we don't understand because they're treated as trade secrets, so we can't see them. And yet they can be very much, they can be very much manipulating our attention. Facebook's a smart company, and the more time we spend on it, the more money it makes. So we should be suspicious about the kind of programming that's going on behind the scenes that determines what we're shown when we go onto these services.
Yeah, I can't remember where I heard this, but the saying that if you get anything for free, then you should know that you are the product.
That's right. We're the thing that Facebook sells to advertisers. And once you start thinking of it in those terms, it becomes a little creepy, and
It does.
probably a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and one final point I wanted to address here. This is actually from a book review you wrote. Actually, a really superior book review that you wrote. I love good book reviews. Like when you're trying to find a good book and someone can write so well that inspires you to go read the book. It's a wonderful thing. Your review of Abby Smith Rumsey's "When We Are No More." This great point that you bring out in the introduction there about the Declaration of Independence when they put it on display in 1997. And as a historian, I'm always aware of this, this twofold, thing that technology does for us. On the one hand, and I think the thing that we see most often is that we can do research in newspapers and, in minutes that would take us, days, months, maybe even years, before these databases were out there. We just spoke with Mark Cheatham, who's doing the digitization of the Martin Van Buren papers to make those available. But as he pointed out there, they're making them available by digitizing them because the last project put them on microfilm, which was seen at the time as this universal technology. Could you talk about the dangers, that you talk about in this review and in some of your work about what happens when we turn, our documents that we leave behind into digital documents and not paper or handwritten documents?
Right. And so there are two different concerns. One is that we aren't recording our thoughts and our activities and our negotiations and stuff on paper anymore. We're doing it digitally. And what the drafts of the Declaration of Independence show very eloquently is that is that having a piece of paper on which different people are editing and adding things and taking away things and crossing out things, that provides that a rich physical record of what actually went on in the room. If you think about today, if the Declaration were written today, it would probably be done via email exchanges or some document in the cloud, and you probably would not see those revisions because people just throw them out or they get lost in time. And so you'd have the document, but it would lack that kind of physicality that in this kind of richness of evidence that you get. So on the one hand, we by simply changing the way we're creating documents, we're probably going to leave a less rich record of what went on for future historians. And then there's also the other issue of when we transfer information from a physical form into a digital form, we tend to assume that it will be more resistant to decay or to time, because we have this sense that anything online is going to last forever.
Right.
And in fact, what you see is that because technological standards change, because certain companies go out of business or into business, software standards change, that actually digital records are quite fragile. And they become even more fragile when we start having big centralized databases, cloud databases. It was one thing when you had the same document, on thousands and thousands of hard drives. At least then you were fairly certain that some copy would survive. Now we've actually developed this, storage system, digital storage system that everybody assumes is very robust and everything will be there forever, but it's actually very, very fragile. And so, what the woman who wrote that book recommends, and I think she's right, is that we need to be much more conscious of the archival function that needs to be applied to all this digital information, or we're going to wake up and find that a lot of it is just gone.
Right. And as a historian who works in the 1920s, if these documents, oftentimes, these documents that I work in from the Soviet Union, who knows what would have been destroyed permanently if it were that easy to do.
Right.
And so there are all types of security issues. And with the Declaration of Independence, we may not have known, if we didn't have that first draft, the irony in Thomas Jefferson writing the first draft of the Declaration of Independence and condemning slavery.
Yeah.
Which is ironic, one of the largest slave owners in the country, or he would be before the end of his life, is condemning slavery, which and that would mean that my students would have one fewer reading to do in my class. So maybe they would like it if it would have been that way.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. I mean, it goes, to a point that's gone through this conversation, is that, there are a lot of unintended consequences that occur when you get a new technology, and we have to be conscious of those. That nothing is simple, and we need to prepare ourselves for bad consequences as well as good ones.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Nicholas Carr, this was a great conversation. I really look forward to having you on campus at MTSU on Monday, March 27th, and take care.
Thanks, and I'm very much looking forward to my visit. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta. Edited by Nick Corrigan, Bob Crawford, and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.